All right, welcome to Doctrines 2. We're continuing our discussion on anthropology, and as we begin today, we're going to be looking at the doctrine of sin, or sometimes called Harmartiology. That's what is sin. Of course, the Greek word hamartios, which is sin. Where does it come from? Where do we inherit sin from Adam, or is this something that each individual chooses for himself? Today we're just going to be looking at what is sin. Let's look at the definition of what is sin. Sin is basically anything that does not conform to God's moral laws. God has put in Scripture His moral law, whether that's the Ten Commandments or characteristics of Himself, who He is, and it's our non-conformity to that in act, in attitude, or in nature that causes us to miss the mark, which is what the word sin means. Hamartia in the Greek means to miss the mark. We're missing the mark of God's law. Notice this includes our attitudes. Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments. The last commandment isn't an action, it's an attitude, to not covet your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife. Notice that's something that happens on the inside. It's in our heart. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, not just those who kill, but rather those who are just angry at their brother, or call them you fool, or someone who lusts after a woman in his heart. Notice that this is not just things that we do, but things that we think, attitudes that we have. In fact, it's even our very nature. The fact that we are sinners. Ephesians 2, that we were dead in trespasses and sins. We were enemies of God. Romans 5, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It's who we are as human beings since the very beginning. The question here has been asked by many theologians: is the essence of sin basically selfishness? Sometimes they look to all the various types of sin that there are, and they say ultimately sin is selfishness, or sometimes they'll say ultimately sin is pride. And it cannot be doubted that the original sin certainly was very selfish, and we can see a lot of selfishness in sin. And of course, sin was found in Satan, which was his great pride. However, there's some things here that I think we need, maybe some nuance here that we need to understand, is that, number one, Scripture doesn't define sin as selfishness. Selfishness is a sin, but not all sin is selfishness. Sometimes even having self-interest is, I wouldn't say good, but it is natural. Things, Matthew 6:20, that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us, or to love your neighbor as yourself. Not saying that we need to love ourselves or have self-love, but the basis of how we should treat others is how we naturally treat ourselves. Jesus doesn't condemn that. He just simply recognizes that. Much sin sometimes involves selfless or selfless acts or motives that people do. They may sin because they're trying to help someone else. Oh, you know what? I don't want you to stumble in this, and so I'm going to lie to you because I don't want to hurt you. And so there's a selfless motive behind a potentially harmful act. Or perhaps this is maybe the nail in the coffin to this doctrine. Since God desires His own glory above all else, He would be considered selfish. People are that God is to be glorified, and forgive the potential blasphemy here, but God would be this most sinful person if we were to define sin simply as selfishness. Of course, that's not the case at all. We know that God desiring His own glory is really what it's all about. In fact, we could perhaps look at it this way. In Romans 3:23, it says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Perhaps the definition is to not glorify God. Romans chapter 1. They did not honor God as God, nor did they give thanks. Perhaps not glorifying God is perhaps the root of sin. But I think it might be unwise to try to look for a root cause or a single sin that defines all the others. Simply say sin is nonconformity to God's moral law. Grudem defines it this way: sin is directly opposite to all that is good in the character of God. And just as God necessarily and eternally delights in himself and in all that he is, so God necessarily and eternally hates sin. So just to sum up here, we understand that sin is not simply selfishness. It's unconformity with the character of God, the moral law of God, which is written from the character of God, and it's ultimately missing that mark of God's glory, of God's character, right?